Why I no longer go to church, sermons like these. Here's a sermon from a few years back of Josh McDowell. Let's take a listen what he has to say.
What's your name?
Carrie,
Carrie, how old are you?
25.
Do you know Jesus Christ personally?
Yes.
Let me ask you, do you believe this is the Word of God?
Yes. Yes.
Do you believe it's true?
Yes.
Do you believe it's historically accurate, reliable?
Yes.
Why?
Well, I don't know. I always did, but then like later there were the Bible codes, and they kind of seem to prove that it's pretty reliable.
Trust me, don't depend upon the Bible codes.
Don't depend on the Bible codes. I agree with him there. You notice this woman, she didn't ask the question, well, which Bible is this? Is this the Catholic Bible? Is this the Protestant Bible? Is this the Greek Orthodox Bible? And I don't know what type of Christian this woman is, but she could have also asked, is this the King James Version, the NIV? She very quickly answered yes, yes, yes to all of Josh's questions, but wouldn't a thoughtful Christian maybe prod a little bit more and not assume what kind of book he's holding there? So let's see where this is going.
Thank you. I won't do what I normally do because of time. Normally I go to about 10 of you and get the same answer. In the last 5 years, about 1,400 people just like this, all believers, all born-again Christians, only one person's answered the question.
Only one person has answered the question out of thousands.
Only one person. Something's wrong.
Something's wrong because only one person out of thousands have answered that question, why do you believe the Bible is God's Word? Or I think what Josh is saying, that only one person out of thousands answered that question correctly. And I guess we'll find out exactly what it means. But if Josh is right here, that only one person out of thousands answered the question correctly, isn't Josh saying that thousands of people, or a high percentage of Christians, believe what they believe about the Bible for wrong reasons? Doesn't that mean that people are just believing first and their reasons are coming second?
I was in the same denomination, but about 1,300, 1,400 hand-selected kids again for the whole Midwest. And I wanted to get a positive answer. And I looked around during the first night and everything, and there was this one youth director, really seemed to have it together, and he was sitting about the 6th row. So I walked up to him. I said, do you believe this is the Word of God? Yep. Do you believe it's true? Yes. Do you believe it's historically accurate, it's reliable? Yes. I said, why? I mean, instantly, he didn't even hesitate. He says, because I have faith. And everybody broke out applauding. I said, let me ask you a question. There's another youth director across the aisle. I said, let's say this guy's a Muslim, and he has faith in the Koran. Does that make the Koran true? And this youth director said, well, yes. So that's youth culture today. Your faith, your belief creates the truth. I want to make sure what kind of folks we have here to make sure we're doctrinally correct. How many of you believe that we're saved by faith? Let me see your hands. That's pure heresy.
I love that. I really do. So far, I'm liking this message, so maybe I will go back to church. What Josh McDowell did there with if a Muslim says that he has faith, does that make the Quran true? That was an excellent question. That is called the outsider test for faith. And basically, you can use the outsider test for faith to test if your reasons for belief are valid. So I really like what Josh McDowell did there. But now here's my question. Later on in the message, I wonder if Josh McDowell would use that same outsider test for faith for other reasons other than faith. For example, transcripts or eyewitnesses, etc.
However, over a period of time, it deteriorates. It rots away. It disintegrates. The ink, they didn't have Parker Brothers then. And they would make ink out of charcoal and everything, and it would be good ink for that time. But after a while, the ink would start to deteriorate. And so the problem is, and people say, well, I can't trust the Bible. We don't have the original manuscripts. I said, well, of course you don't have the original manuscripts. I mean, you can't historically for anything like that.
Of course you don't have the original manuscripts. You can't historically for anything like that. Now, wait a minute. Of course you don't have the original manuscripts. You can't historically for anything like that. What if I was to replace the word manuscripts, original manuscripts, with resurrection? Of course you don't have a resurrection. You can't historically for anything like that. But yet, Josh, you would say there was a resurrection. We're talking about your God here, who's omnipotent, right? Why couldn't your God have done a miracle to preserve the originals?
And so there's two questions they ask about the manuscript. The first question is this, the timeline. Now this is where I wish I had all the graphics. The timeline. You say, what do you mean timeline? Well, see, you'd have the original. Let's say this is the original. You would have that. Now, that would start to deteriorate, start to rot away. So from that, they would copy another. And then that would start to rot away. From that, they'd copy another ad infinitum. And the question is, the copy that you have, what is the distance to the original, which would be referred to as the autographa, which means auto, A-U-T-O, grapha, G-R-A-P-H-A, autographa. Now, the closer, the rule of thumb historically means it's not always true, most time it is. The closer the copy to the original, the greater the accuracy. That's not always true, but it's a pretty good rule of thumb.
The closer the copy is to the original, the greater the accuracy. And Josh admits that's not always true. Okay, let's listen to Bart Ehrman here for a bit. He is a biblical historian that a lot of Christians admire because they champion him when he goes against the mythicists who say that Jesus never even existed. So they'll point to this guy, Bart Ehrman, and say, here's a historian who says that's crazy talk. Jesus, of course, existed. But let's listen to what Bart Ehrman has to say about copies.
The first person who copied the Gospel of Mark, no doubt, made mistakes. Now, how was Mark copied after that? Well, the original would have been copied, but then the copy would have been copied. And the problem is, when somebody copied the copy, they not only copied the original words, they copied the mistakes that the first scribe had made. And they made their own mistakes. What happened then when somebody came along and copied that second copy? That person replicated the mistakes of both of his predecessors and made his own mistakes. And copies were made week after week, year after year, decade after decade. Copies were being made of the Gospel of Mark. Copies of the original, in which every time a new copy was made, the mistakes of the predecessors were repeated.
Okay, I know what some Christians might be thinking right now. They're thinking, no, God would never allow that. God would not allow mistakes in the copies. If you are a Christian thinking that right now, if you're saying that God would miraculously do something to prevent the copiers from being fallible in their copying, that is kind of like a miracle to me. But if God is going to go that far to protect his word so that his word is transmitted without error from copy to copy to copy, why wouldn't God do the miracle of preserving the original?
Unless somebody had the bright idea of correcting the mistakes. Now, it's not always clear if a scribe would know where there had been a mistake made. It may be that in places, in fact, the scribe who's copying something didn't just make a grammatical error or sort of fall asleep for a second and leave out a word, but maybe he actually changed the text because he thought it would make better sense if he changed it to say this instead of that. Well, if that's what he did, how would his successor, the next copyist, know that he had made the change? Only if he had the original to compare it with. But if he didn't have the original to compare it with, then he wouldn't know that a mistake had been made in many places, and so he would copy that mistake. But suppose he thought the mistake had been made, but he didn't have the original to compare it with. How would he correct the mistake? He would take his best guess at what probably the original said.
So what Bart Ehrman is saying here is, it doesn't even matter how close the copies are to the original. If that very first copy is incorrect, then everything down the stream is going to be incorrect. So the distance from our first manuscripts of the Bible or the New Testament to the original is almost irrelevant if that first copy had errors.
But what if he guessed wrong? It's possible that scribes corrected mistakes incorrectly. And then you've got three problems at that place. You've got the original text, you've got the original mistake, and you've got a mistake in correction of the original mistake. And so it goes for week after year after decade, on and on and on, copies made of copies made of copies. This went on for a very long time, and eventually the original Gospel of Mark was lost. We no longer have the original Gospel of Mark, and we don't have the original copy of Mark, and we don't have a copy of the copy of Mark or a copy of the copy of the copy of Mark. Now, what I'm telling you now is not sort of slanted information. I'm telling you facts. We don't have anything like the original of Mark's Gospel or an early copy of Mark's Gospel.
Now, the second question is this. First one is, what is the timeline from the original to the closest copy? The second is this, how many copies do you have? You see, the rule of thumb is, the more copies you have, the easier it is to reconstruct the autographa, the original, and check out any errors or discrepancies that we have what was written down. Now, that's not always true, but probably 90-95% of the time it is true. Like if you have 5 manuscripts and you have 100, I mean the difference to be able to check out the accuracy is not even comparable between 5 and 100.
So Josh is saying here that the more copies you have, the more manuscripts you have, the easier it is to double check the accuracy. The problem with this, though, is it might not work in your favor, Josh. The more manuscripts, the more copies you have, could show more discrepancies than the fewer transcripts you have, the fewer manuscripts you have. So I'm going to play Bart Ehrman here and show you what he has to say about the number of copies and the errors within them.
Let me start by saying that when Craig says that the following view is a view of skeptics, that we don't have the originals, we have only copies, that thousands of copies have thousands and 10,000s of mistakes, when he calls that the view of skeptics, it's true, that is the view of skeptics, and it's the view of non-skeptics. It's the view of every scholar who works in this field, including Craig. Everybody agrees. We don't have the originals, we have thousands of copies, and the thousands of copies have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of differences among them. Are any of these differences important, or are they all fluff? Did Jesus say, "Let the one who is without sin be the first to cast a stone at her"? It's a wonderful and familiar saying of Jesus, but it's based on a scribal variation that is an error. It was not originally in the New Testament Gospels, as Craig has just told us. Did Jesus say, "Neither do I condemn you, go and sin no more"? Well, does it matter whether Jesus said it or not? Turns out it's only in a textual variant. It was not in the original New Testament. Did Jesus say, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to the whole creation. He who believes in me and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not will be condemned"? It's found only in a textual variant. These are the signs that will accompany those who believe. In my name they will cast out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up serpents. And if they drink any deadly thing, it will not hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick and they will recover. Does it matter if Jesus said it? It certainly matters to the Christian groups in the Appalachian Mountains who practice snake handling as part of their worship services.
This is an important part. What Ehrman's talking about is the last few verses of the book of Mark, where some Bibles will not even have the last 19 verses, and some Bibles do, or they'll have footnotes saying this wasn't in the original manuscripts. So this is a very important point of when someone says that they believe the Bible is true, or that the Bible is God's Word. What Bible are they talking about if Bibles actually differ in the number of verses they have in them?
Did Jesus give the entire Lord's Prayer, or just half of it, as in Luke? Does it matter? It depends on which manuscript you read. Or do other textual variants matter? Does it matter whether the doctrine of the Trinity is explicitly taught in the New Testament? The only verse that comes close to teaching it directly is 1 John chapter 5, verses 7 and 8. There are 3 that bear witness in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Spirit, and these 3 are one. Does it matter if that's in the New Testament? Does it matter whether the Gospel of John ever calls Jesus the unique God or not? It's based on a textual variant. Does it matter whether the Gospel of Luke teaches a doctrine of atonement or not? The view that Jesus died for the sake of others. It depends on a textual variant. Does it matter if Jesus was in such agony before his arrest that he sweat blood? It's found in only a single textual variant of the Gospel of Luke. Does it matter that entire words, lines, paragraphs, and pages were left out by some scribes? Does it matter that there are numerous places in the New Testament where scholars cannot decide what the original text said? Does it matter that there are some places where we will never know what the original author said? Does that matter or not?
Okay, so here you have a professional biblical historian saying that there are thousands of errors in the Bible, and a lot of these errors are not fluff. They're significant errors. And we know this because of all the manuscripts and by comparing the manuscripts with one another. Now Josh is here in this sermon saying that because of these manuscripts, the number of manuscripts, that we can trust it, that we can say that we do have something that is true. But let me ask this question. Does the number of manuscripts in itself determine truth? For example, if we had twice the number of manuscripts that we do have for the New Testament, would it make it twice as true? If we had half the manuscripts that we have for the New Testament, would it be half as true? If your answer is no, then we would say the number of transcripts in itself has no bearing on whether it's true or not. And what Bart Ehrman just said is it almost works against what Josh is saying, that the number of manuscripts helps historians actually figure out all the errors in the Bible.
You can take every Bible in the world and destroy it. Take every manuscript in the world and burn it. And without any Bibles, without any biblical manuscripts, within 200 to 300 years, which is 1/5 less than almost all secular literature, within 250 to 300 years, I can reconstruct all but 11 verses of the entire New Testament. Say, now wait a minute. Without any Bibles, that's right. Without any manuscripts, that's right. As far as I know, it's the only book you can do it with.
I'm not sure what point Josh is trying to make there, that you can reconstruct the Bible without any of the manuscripts, just based on, I guess, the attestations or the referring to the New Testament from sermons in the past. There are Muslims today who can recite the whole Quran from memory. Does that mean the Quran is true? So I'm not exactly sure what point that Josh is making here.
No, I believe I can hold the Bible in my hand and say what we have today is what was written down. In fact, any part that's a question, you take the New Testament's, Nestle's New Testament Greek. Now it's about that big and about that thick, very thin paper. Any words that are in question, that what we have today is what was written down, is less than 1/2 of 1 page. And if you know anything about literature, that is absolutely miraculous.
I think Bart Ehrman would disagree with you on that. Bart Ehrman, we just heard, said that there's thousands and thousands of errors, discrepancies between manuscripts, and that a lot of these differences are not minor, that they're theological in nature.
And not one of the words relates to any major doctrine. That's how carefully God preserved his word.
If God carefully preserved his word, why didn't he preserve the originals?
I believe what we have today is what was written down, but then the question, was what was written down true? Is this really what Jesus did and Jesus said? Or was it fiction? Tales people added to it, changed what they thought would look good, sound good, they put into it. There's several lines of evidence that deal with this. First two have to come with the writers of the New Testament. Please stick this in your mind. The first is this. The writers of the New Testament wrote as eyewitnesses, or they recorded eyewitness accounts like Mark and Luke. Eyewitness accounts. They either wrote as eyewitnesses or recorded eyewitness accounts. And now with taking Mark and Matthew back before 60, 65 AD, it is mind-blowing to the critics to say, well, they couldn't have been eyewitnesses and everything. Now they're saying, they had to be eyewitnesses.
They had to be eyewitnesses. Let's listen to Bart Ehrman, what he has to say about eyewitnesses.
The truth may not be what you were taught, but if it's true, you should believe it, not run from it. As I studied more and more using my intelligence as an evangelical, but also praying about it, I became convinced that the New Testament Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses or by people who knew eyewitnesses. The first point to make is the rather obvious one that the Gospels don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses. They are all anonymous. The titles in your Gospels, the Gospel according to Matthew and so forth, were added by later editors. They were not put there by the original authors. Second point, none of the Gospels claims to be written by the person whose name it bears. They don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses, and they don't claim to be written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are later traditions that were added to the Gospels. These traditions do not start appearing for about 100 years. Some people think that there is an early church father named Papias who attests to the witness of Mark and Matthew, but in fact there are very solid reasons for thinking that Papias, who lived around the year 120 to 140, is not referring to our Mark or our Matthew. The first time anybody refers to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by name is Irenaeus in the year 180. But the unfortunate thing about Jesus is that we have such scanty documentation about his life. Most people don't realize this. But Jesus is never mentioned in any Greek or Roman non-Christian source until 80 years after his death. There is no record of Jesus having lived in these sources. In the entire first Christian century, Jesus is not mentioned by a single Greek or Roman historian, religion scholar, politician, philosopher, or poet. His name never occurs in a single inscription, and it is never found in a single piece of private correspondence. Zero, zip, references.
I remember growing up as a Christian thinking, oh yeah, these are eyewitnesses. The Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, and there was firsthand accounts of the life of Jesus. But as I got older, I started looking into it. The Gospels are not autographed. We do not know whether Matthew, Mark, Luke, John wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. They're written in the third person. Think about the nativity scene, the birth story of Jesus. Were the authors there to see that? Probably not. So if they weren't needed to be there to see the birth of Jesus and to tell that story, did they need to be there for any of it? And as Bart Ehrman pointed out, not only are the Gospels not written by eyewitnesses, or probably not written by eyewitnesses, there is no other record outside the Gospels of eyewitness accounts of Jesus. Josephus, he wasn't an eyewitness. All the extra biblical evidence for Jesus is hearsay. It's what the early Christian church told these other people.
Then, in 1 Corinthians 15, 6 to 8, after that, he appeared to more than 500 people at one time, most of whom remain alive until now. Eyewitnesses. In Acts 10, 39 to 42, and we are witnesses of all the things he did both in the land of the Jews and in Jerusalem. And they also put him to death by hanging him on a cross. God raised him up on the third day and granted that he should become visible not to all the people, but to witnesses who were chosen beforehand by God, who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead, and he ordered us to preach this to the people.
So I love the what's more likely question. What is more likely, that a man rose from the dead and appeared to 500 witnesses, or that a book just says that happened? Now I can hear what people are thinking. They're thinking, well, Doug, if you're not going to believe the historical record, then you have to throw out all history. But what we have here is an extraordinary claim. Throughout all history, a person rising from the dead after 3 days is an extraordinary claim. Now, do we have extraordinary evidence for this? No. We have a book that says there's eyewitnesses to this event. Do you believe the eyewitnesses of alien abduction? There are people today, we could get in a plane, we could fly around and interview every single person who's made such an extraordinary claim. Would you believe them? Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't, I don't know. But isn't alive witnesses better than dead ones? Plus, if you do any reading about the justice system, eyewitness testimony is one of the worst forms of evidence out there. It doesn't even come close to forensic DNA type evidence. So here we have an extraordinary claim with subpar evidence. Now, one could say, well, that's just the best evidence we have for that time period. So if this is true, we're kind of in a stuck position in believing such an extraordinary claim throughout history with non-extraordinary evidence throughout history. I want to play for you a clip from Sam Harris about eyewitnesses.
We consider Christianity. The entire doctrine is predicated on the idea that the gospel account of the miracles of Jesus is true. This is why people believe Jesus was the Son of God, divine, etc. This textual claim is problematic because everyone acknowledges that the Gospels followed Jesus' ministry by decades, and there's no extra-biblical account of his miracles. But the truth is quite a bit worse than that. The truth is, even if we had multiple contemporaneous eyewitness accounts of the miracles of Jesus, this still would not provide sufficient basis to believe that these events actually occurred. Well, why not? Well, the problem is that first-hand reports of miracles are quite common, even in the 21st century. I have met literally hundreds at this point of Western-educated men and women who think that their favorite Hindu or Buddhist guru has magic powers. All the powers ascribed to these gurus are every bit as outlandish as those ascribed to Jesus. Now, I actually remain open to evidence of such powers, but the fact is that people who tell these stories desperately want to believe them. All, to my knowledge, lack the kind of corroborating evidence we should require before believing that nature's laws have been abrogated in this way. And people who believe these stories show an uncanny reluctance to look for non-miraculous causes. But it remains a fact that yogis and mystics are said to be walking on water and raising the dead and flying without the aid of technology, materializing objects, reading minds, foretelling the future, right now. In fact, all of these powers have been ascribed to Satya Sai Baba, the South Indian guru, by an uncountable number of eyewitnesses. Now, he even claims to have been born of a virgin, which is not all that uncommon a claim in the history of religion, or in history generally. Genghis Khan supposedly was born of a virgin, as was Alexander. Apparently, parthenogenesis doesn't guarantee that you're going to turn the other cheek. But Satya Sai Baba is not a fringe figure. He's not the David Koresh of Hinduism. His followers threw a birthday party for him recently, and 1 million people showed up. So there are vast numbers of people who believe he is a living God. You can even watch his miracles on YouTube. Prepare to be underwhelmed. I mean, it's true that he has an afro of sufficient diameter as to suggest a total detachment from the opinions of his fellow human beings, but I'm not sure this is reason enough to worship him. In any case, so consider, as though for the first time, the foundational claim of Christianity. The claim is this, that miracle stories of a sort that today surround a person like Satya Sai Baba become especially compelling when you set them in the pre-scientific religious context of the first century Roman Empire, decades after their supposed occurrence. We have Satya Sai Baba's miracle stories attested to by thousands upon thousands of living eyewitnesses, and they don't even merit an hour on the Discovery Channel. But you place a few miracle stories in some ancient books, and half the people on this earth think it a legitimate project to organize their lives around them. Does anyone else see a problem with that?
Here were 12 men. 11 of the 12, for sure, 10 of the 12 died martyrs' deaths. Some of the most horrible deaths in history. For one thing, an empty tomb in the appearance of a man by the name of Jesus of Nazareth, that in their own words they said for 40 days after the resurrection, he was crucified, killed, and buried, that they lived with him, they walked with him with many convincing proofs, and with over 500 people at one time. The first critic will say, well, a lot of people have died for a lie. Well, that's true. That is true. Every one of us can write a book in history on people that have died for lies. So they say, what's the big deal? I said, here's the big deal. Yes, a lot of people have died for a lie. But they always thought it was the truth. You see what I'm saying? Yes, a lot of people have died for a lie, but they always thought it was the truth. Now, if the resurrection was a lie, these 12 men had to know it. And therefore, they not only died for a lie, they knew it was a lie. Whew. I'll challenge you to find 3, let alone 11, who have ever done that in history.
I hear this argument a lot from Christians that if this was not true, why would these disciples willingly die for what they knew was a lie? First question, how do we know they died a martyr's death? How do we know that? It's not in the Bible. Question number 2, how do we know that they didn't recant and they were just killed anyhow? Think of Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith started Mormonism. And he died because of what he preached about Mormonism. He did what he did day after day. Eventually it caught up with him. A mob killed him. He could have recanted at the last minute, but what would have mattered? The mob would have still killed him. These Christians who believed that Jesus rose from the dead might have lived their lives preaching and so forth, and then when it came to being killed for what they were doing, they could have recanted. But it wouldn't have mattered at that point. They probably would have still been killed for sedition, for raising the ire against the government or whoever. Here's Robert Price, another biblical historian, talking about eyewitnesses and would they die for something they knew was a lie.
Apostles would not die for a lie. I'm sure they wouldn't have, but we have no evidence of how any of them, I think, except James, the son of Zebedee, who was beheaded at the order of Herod Agrippa I. We don't know how any of these guys died. The only information we think we have is from the 2nd century Acts of Paul, where Nero has Paul's head chopped off, and then in the next scene he walks back in, raised from the dead, and said, okay, Nero, you're next. Or in 1 Clement, an anonymous, actually, text from the end of the 1st century, where it says that Paul and Peter gave witness in Rome. We assume they're talking about their death, but we really have no evidence except for like apocryphal books and 3rd century traditions about how any of the apostles died. There were martyrs during the time of these terrible persecutions that Decius and Diocletian unleashed, but there you're talking about people that would never have been in a position to know whether Jesus rose from the dead or not. They were heroic and died for their faith, but being sincere about something doesn't make you right.
So I believe doubt's a virtue. I believe that when we admit to ourselves we could be wrong about something, that brings us closer to humility. I believe that when we say we're certain about something, it can lead to arrogance and cockiness, overconfidence. I think I've presented enough reasons to doubt what you believe. Do you remember how Josh McDowell started this message when he interviewed that young lady in the crowd? And he was illustrating a point that many Christians believe for the wrong reason. At least in Josh McDowell's opinion, they believe for the wrong reason. And then Josh McDowell then provided good reasons to believe. But what Josh McDowell is illustrating here is that beliefs come first, reasons come second. So even though Josh McDowell provided reasons to believe, I think I have presented evidence to doubt those reasons. And I believe doubt is a virtue. Don't you wish other religions, other people within other religions would doubt what they believe just a little bit? So why not have that expectation about yourself?